pleasure being here tonight to introduce Bruce Fein. As we've partnered with Barnes & Noble, the Ruff Institute, to do speakers throughout the year. Speakers that friends we know, reliable people, people like Bruce Fein, who has a lot of credentials, by the way, and that's why I have this piece of paper. I can't do it off the cuff. He is the architect of the recent class action lawsuit filed by Senator Rand Paul against the National Security Agency. One of our, if you're a freedom fighter, you really like the NSA because they stick to the Constitution. It's to fight the mass surveillance of American communications that we're seeing the spying the NSA is doing. Bruce also serves on the Ruff Institute Board of Directors. He is former Associate Deputy Attorney General of the United States under Ronald Reagan, an adjunct scholar with the American Enterprise Institute, a resident scholar at the Heritage Foundation, a lecturer at the Brookings Institute, and an adjunct professor at George Washington University. He's filed numerous lawsuits, cases before the Supreme Court. We've worked with him on some of those. He served as executive editor of the World Intelligence Review. He's authored several volumes on the Constitution and various other books, and the book tonight, which he will be signing after he speaks. Pleasure having you down here. This is one of the most erudite, knowledgeable persons on history and the Constitution that I know alive today. So he's a real treat for us.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And I always begin by quoting from my good friend Samuel Johnson, writing several centuries ago, a moderator in making effusive introductions is not under oath, right? You get to exaggerate. I want to discuss today, I think, the peril of the United States that has grown more acute, even in this couple of years since I authored this book, about the disregard of the Constitution, its moral cornerstones, and how we as citizens of the United States, who they occupy the highest office under the Constitution, have a duty, not just the right, a duty to become active, to try to call to account those officers who are flouting their oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. Because if we don't initiate that action, whether it's through letters, phone calls, participating in politics or otherwise, I think we're destined to plunge from the republic that was won in 1776 to an empire, just as happened to the previous 72 empires, most recently the British Empire. And it's our duty, I think, to prevent any future historian to write about our generation that what Tacitus wrote about the Roman Republic generation before it descended to an empire. The worst crimes were dared by a few, willed by more, tolerated by all. And that's the death knell of the Republic, when that citizen obligation to participate and be acutely aware of government wrongdoing and the danger to the rule of law to fail to stand up. And I was someone whose baptism in Washington was Watergate, when a third-rate burglary, the authorization of the plumber that burglarized the home of Daniel Ellsberg psychiatrist and the break-in of the DNC, obstruction of justice crimes led to the ouster of Richard Nixon. There were articles of impeachment, and he resigned because the Senate clearly was going to impeach him, of impeachable offenses, including the failure to faithfully execute the laws, and obstruction of justice, and failure to respond to a congressional subpoena investigating the wrongdoing. Let's just fast forward to today. What kind of powers did the president exercise, in violation of the Constitution? The most awesome and frightening power is his authority, which he's used on 4 occasions against American citizens, to say that I am endowed with a right to choose anyone on the planet and kill them if I decide unilaterally they're an imminent danger to the United States. There is no review by Congress, no review by us citizens, no review by judges, nothing. It's just he can vaporize anyone on his say-so alone. It's hard to imagine a more tyrannical power. Say there have been 4 American citizens killed this way. According to news reports, there's the 5th that's under possible investigation. And we have this Orwellian argument that it satisfies due process under the Constitution. Due process, the most important concept in the history of civilization. The first recognition I could be wrong. You have to listen to somebody before you convict them of wrongdoing and kill them or punish them. That's satisfied if the executive branch looks at the same evidence and then looks at it again and says, well, I think I really got what I got. That satisfies due process. I mean, this is what we thought we eliminated with Magna Carta in 1215. No one's life or liberty can be deprived without due process of law, the law of the land. And yet, what is the reaction to this flagrant constitutional violation? Shrug shoulders, no congressional oversight, nothing. And I say, the reason why this is so important is because it sets the theme of, well, if he can do that, kill us all, well, of course he can spy on us. We should be happy that he's not killing us, right? Or just detain us at Guantanamo Bay. At least we're alive. So we should be thankful that the president is as ruthless as he really could be. I say, contrary to our whole idea is that in a free society, we have the rights. They're stewards of our liberty, not destroyers of our liberty, who hold and exercise governmental powers. This danger that we confront here is something that can only be changed with one, an aroused citizenry, and two, knowledge and wisdom. Why is this so contrary to who we are as a people? And that has to be a subject and endeavor that we perform today. It's got to be in the classroom. It has to be around the dinner table. And the reason why I'm stressing this is we can't just blame the members of Congress or the executive branch for usurping power for not discharging their duties as they're at fault. Because ultimately, we still are masters of our fate, captains of our soul. We get to chart the destiny of the country. And even though some people suggest that, well, we're so weak, one voice, it doesn't matter. I mean, I remember recently, like, hundreds of thousands of Americans told their members of Congress and Barack Obama, you don't go to war to Syria. And he flinched. He didn't say, I can do anything. He flinched. That's the reason why we're not in Syria today. And earlier on, in the first bailout vote under President Bush, where the American people said, we don't want to give Goldman Sachs, $50 billion because they ran their company into the ground. The House of Representatives, despite all the pundits saying, the world would collapse if we didn't throw trillions of dollars at poorly run banks, they voted against it. That should give you some confidence that the system still, in its basic architecture, will work if we utilize it. If we utilize it. Remember, the Nixon impeachment hearings began because millions of Americans, after the Saturday Night Massacre, said, no, that's not what this country is. The president can't act unilaterally. And the Congress responded. We are inclined to say, well, we have these megalomaniacs in the White House and the executive branch that keep seeking more power. Yes, the Founding Fathers understood that. The Constitution understands it. That's why we have checks and balances and still elections and government of the people, by the people, for the people. Because it's anticipated that government officials will seek to aggrandize power. And the same with Congress. So I want to leave you with anything. It's us to say no. But I want to go more systematically, I think, through the wholesale abandonment of basic constitutional principles and start with morality. Because the Constitution is more than just a document for lawyers to argue about in court, right? It sets values of who we are as a people. And perhaps the most important constitutional principle that was the background of everything written is the idea that morally it is better to risk being the victim of injustice than to be complicit in it. It's morally to risk being the victim of injustice. That would explain why we don't permit somebody to be convicted of a suspected crime on a crumb of evidence, on the idea, well, we don't want to risk that person going free because even if there's a tiny possibility that he was the culprit, we should punish him. That kind of attitude makes us complicit in injustice because we risk convicting innocent people. A crumb of evidence? So the whole idea that we have that in criminal cases the Constitution requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt is an implementation of this philosophical wisdom. At least we are not complicit in injustice. That makes us a depraved people. And think of how that one principle gets shifted on its head. If we go back to the predator drone program, we risk being complicit in injustice all the time. How do we select targets? Do we have proof beyond a reasonable doubt? We use metadata about where we think a cell phone is and who is connected to terrorism, and then target the cell phone, whoever has it. To say these are not just theoretical propositions. And let me give you one vignette among several that should make us, in some sense, I believe, all ashamed that we are Americans who are morally complicit in this wrongdoing. The vignette was made graphic by a 9-year-old granddaughter who visited the United States a couple of months ago to testify about the killing of her 68-year-old grandmother by a predator drone in Pakistan. Well, they were picking vegetables. They were not in the midst of suspected terrorism, picking vegetables. And she explained that she heard a buzzing noise, that all the ground where they're picking vegetables was blackened. She heard screaming. She says, this is a 9-year-old, that braver. She's testifying for a congressional committee. She heard screaming. She thought maybe it was her grandmother, wasn't sure. She ran as fast as she could because she was frightened, 9-year-old. She saw blood on her hands. She grabbed her hands to try to make the blood stop. She couldn't. And then went back, her grandmother, 68-year-old, was dead. That's the United States of America who committed it. The United States of America. And we need, since we have government by the consent of the government, that is a moral wrong that in some sense we're quiescent. All right, well, that's just part of the war and the international terrorism. You kill 68-year-old grandmothers and just shrug your shoulders. That's one example, but there are literally thousands of killings of this sort. And this, again, violates the principle. We need to take risks, even of being the victim of injustice, so that we don't end up killing 68-year-old grandmothers. I mean, another example was the killing of a teenager, Anwar al-Awlaki's teenage son, while he's having dinner with some relatives. This was after the United States had killed his father, Anwar al-Awlaki, even though the father, he purportedly, according to news reports, was the mastermind of all these devilish things. He hadn't even been accused of a crime. There was no outstanding indictment. There was no charge. Nothing even like Edward Snowden. And then we just suddenly vaporize it. And then a couple of weeks later, his son. And then his son just he becomes a disappeared person. Whoever reads about him in the newspapers, right? When you hear about, the predator drones killed X, Y, or Z militants. But again, I want to go back and examine this whole idea that the procedural mechanisms that we use, the powers of government that we exercise in trying to prevent any kind of threat to the United States must satisfy this basic moral principle if it's going to be consistent with the United States constitutional cornerstones. We are willing to risk injustice to preserve liberty and not become complicit in it. We go now to the Fourth Amendment. The whole idea of the Fourth Amendment is an implementation of that principle. We say it may make us safer. We may be able to thwart some kind of crimes if the government could go and search anybody's home, detain anybody at any time, any place, right? But the Fourth Amendment says, no, that is too great a price on liberty that we cherish. That the government can't disturb your right to be let alone unless there is probable cause to believe that you or the information you have is related to a particularized crime. No fishing expeditions. No fishing expeditions. And I go back, think of this principle. Yeah, we tie the government's hands, even in searching for possible terrorism crime, because we believe liberty is more important than this, what I call, this futile quest for a risk-free existence. You want to live a risk-free existence? Put everybody in prison, right? No one can testify they're a saint and can never do any wrong, so everyone's a risk at some point. Hey, we can't wait till the mushroom cloud goes, everyone gets to go to San Quentin or someplace like that. And we see how ridiculous that is. How ridiculous, then the whole purpose of the nation is ended. Why don't we just turn into an unfree country? And one of the things that's so discouraging in the debate about these constitutional principles is they're all drowned out. Make us safe. even hear the president saying, I was elected to make you safe. Well, I looked up, my Constitution says, president elected to make me safe? Where's that in the Constitution? I do see where the president is elected to take care that the laws, including the Constitution, be faithfully executed, but not just make us safe. I don't want to deride safety, obviously. We want to be prudent about things. And when there is clear evidence of wrongdoing, we want to search for it and apprehend those who are wrongdoers. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it comes to judgment calls, where there's issues of risk, and we're dealing in a world of conjecture and imponderables, right? You know, the future isn't written in stone. The idea of the Constitution is we take those imponderables and we resolve them in favor of liberty unless there's a reason otherwise. The default position is our right to chart our own destiny. And the government always has the burden under the Constitution to faithfully fulfill, to explain why they need to disturb your choice, why they need to disturb your tranquility. And we've sort of turned that constitutional precept on its head. We say the government can do anything unless we have a good reason to believe that they'll turn into the Gestapo. You know, that's the level that we should accept in encroaching on our liberty. And say, that certainly is not the life that the Constitution envisioned for the American people, the American citizens. And if you want to know, I think, the spirit of the Fourth Amendment, the spirit of liberty that infused the founding generation, it comes from a speech that William Pitt the Elder had made in 1763 to the British Parliament, in which he was denouncing the general fishing expeditions that the British government, under a king, were taking within Britain. And he stated as follows: the poorest man in his cottage may bid defiance to all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, the roof may shake, the storm may enter, the wind may blow through it, the rains may enter, but the King of England cannot enter. All his forces dare not cross the threshold of the ruined tenement. That's the spirit of the Fourth Amendment. We hear anything like that today? Oh, we need to gather everything on everybody. You don't have a right to be free from anything. Surveillance drones, telephony, metadata, everything the government can do. They want to put in some huge, huge database. And then the latest, I guess, is the Department of Homeland Security wanted to collect all the license plates throughout the country. Which betrays, I think, a very insecure state of mind. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this when we as a nation are the safest in the history of our country? We are the sole superpower of the world. We have vastly more arms. We spend vastly more on national security than all the rest of the world combined. $1 trillion a year. Where is the danger? It's diminished to virtually nothing after the Soviet Union disintegrated. And yet we act as though, my gosh, we're about ready to disappear. And a caliphate will be in Washington, D.C. unless we undertake all these very muscular efforts to make us safe, make us safe. And they'd say that really is a violation of the basic principle of the Constitution. That the goal here is not safety. The goal is liberty, with the prevention of foreign aggression and any predation that one encounters domestically. Because the whole distinction of the United States from every previous government was that the purpose of a nation is not to aggrandize itself. It's not to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy or build empires. The purpose was to give every individual a fair opportunity to succeed. That choice, that ability to choose what fulfills that individual, and the liberty that he has in charting his own destiny is its own justification. Whether it makes the country rich or poor, the fact that we gave each individual that choice and provided the opportunity itself is success for the government. And we are founded on the idea that that is the sole purpose of government. We secure these unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness by forming a government that prevents the predation or foreign aggression, but that is it. It doesn't. We speak today of, well, what are the purposes of a government? Well, the unemployment rate should be X and the money supply should be Y and we should have so many riches here or there. That's not the purpose. It's to let the individuals decide whether they think rich is better than poor by their own choices. The government shouldn't stand there and say, well, this is the national goal, or that's not their business. That's us. We get to decide what we want to make of our life. The government doesn't get to tell us that. And it's that choice is the essence of what the Constitution aims to preserve and to celebrate and to honor. And we as a people, unfortunately, I think, have accepted this campaign amongst the politicians saying, no, the purpose of government is to be number one or number three. We have world leadership, and my gosh, it's like ranks at the football teams, and we can't afford to be 3 or 5 or whatever that means. And that becomes the national debate. And Romney and Obama, the last debate, well, we're exceptional and we have to do things to keep us number one in the world. We have an inherent obligation on the Constitution to be world leader. I said, really? Where is it? In invisible ink? I've read the document 1,000,000 times. There's nothing about being world leader or anything else. Why are we need to compare ourselves to our own standards. Not that we're superior to Saudi Arabia on habeas corpus, our own standards. Because we need to make certain that what we do says about us as a people honoring liberty. Not what it says whether Osama bin Laden would torture one of our prisoners, one of our military people who was caught. He may torture them, that doesn't mean torture detainees that we capture. Because, as I say, it is more important that we honor these principles of liberty and moral justice than necessarily we rank some particular place in somebody's imagination amongst greatness in the world. Because greatness is not territorial aggrandizement. That's not, greatness is moral suasion and moral legitimacy. James Madison, who was the author of the Constitution, author of the Bill of Rights, wrote in Federalist 51 that the reason why we come from a state of nature and form governments, he says, is to seek justice. Justice, the convergence of moral philosophy with law. That's why we even have government. He doesn't talk about, well, the reason we have governments is say be number 1 or number 3 or become rich or become powerful with arms. No. I mean, he would laugh at that as being pre-Magna Carta thinking. And it is very dismaying, I think, today that when we have discussions in Congress, the executive, the media, the talk shows about who we are as a nation and the Constitution, this all bereft. Have you ever heard moral arguments as though that has anything to do with who we are as a people? No, it's all, we won, can we win this, can we win that? What will it play out in the next election cycle or something of that sort? It's really quite almost childish kind of discussion. And it's always, well, who gains and who loses by this or that. Remember, the spirit of the Constitution is real politics is trying to make sure everyone is a winner. We don't gloat that someone falls down. We want to give everyone a fair opportunity, whether they're Republican or Democrat or men or women or whatever. We want everybody to win in politics. Why do we gloat or become elated that somebody's a loser? And that's remembering that that's the goal, the right to choose our own destiny. Everybody's going to find their rewards in different ways, different fulfillments. And that's just because we're not clones. Different people, we ought to honor that and respect it. As he said, the ultimate greatness of the nation doesn't make it, and recognize that the individuals get to make those judgments as to why they're here and how they want to spend their time and resources. So where are we now in terms of, historically, the end of the freedom and the rule of law and the final descent, what I call, into empire. Here, I think it would be one branch government. I think we probably are 20 or 30 years maximum away from a system whereby virtually all decisions of import will be made by the President of the United States, largely in secrecy. and the Congress will have delegated, acquiesced in the usurpation of powers over the budget, taxation, or otherwise to the president. And that conclusion comes from, if you look at a survey of how much power over the last decades has migrated from the Congress to the executive. We already talked about he can kill anybody on the planet. He doesn't have to on his say-so that they're in imminent danger to the United States national security in violation of the Due Process Clause. The President clearly has usurped the war power. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 says only Congress can authorize the initiation of war. It was the most important clause in the entire Constitutional Convention because everyone recognized that perpetual war is the death knell of a republic. You cannot have a republic in constant warfare because Cicero wrote 2,000 years ago, in times of war, the law is silent. In World War II, despite the greatest generation, we stuck 120,000 loyal Japanese Americans in concentration camps. Shrugged our shoulders. We said, to the Occidental eye, we can't distinguish among Japs, so we got to stick them in concentration camps because we can't follow them if we think that they're bent on espionage. So the Founding Fathers devoted an enormous amount of discussion as how could we prevent warfare that was chronic, especially in countries where the executive was powerful. The King of England, for instance, could go to war on his own. Didn't need parliamentary approval. And so the Founding Fathers said, no, we have to lodge this power in the Congress because they don't have a conflict of interest in authorizing war, since in times of war, the President gets all the power, right? Gets the contracts, he gets the footprints in the sands of time, the jingoism, he gets the secrecy, the control over the taxes, the spending, and the immediate deference to executive decisions as commander-in-chief. And all the history of politics showed that wars are characteristically bound by executives because they exaggerate danger and say, here's my chance to get more power voluntarily because I'll frighten the people to think that if they don't give me the power, they're going to be subject to some kind of massive defeat. And presidents, not just Obama, in modern life have usurped the war power openly and notoriously. Most recently, President Obama, he entered into the Libya war without any authorization whatsoever. I think amongst everyone here who's read anything about the possibility of war with Iran, if it doesn't, or if it requires a nuclear capability, probably all assume that decision would be made by the President. I mean, in this discussion and in the Congress and the media, nobody even mentions that Congress would have any role about whether we attack Iran. Say, really? He just does that on his own? Can he carry warfare to any place in the globe based upon his decision alone? Especially when the language of the Constitution is so explicit. And every single member of the Constitutional Convention agreed only Congress should authorize the initiation of war because they knew the Republic would end standing armies and claims that everything has to be suspended in the name of national security and survival. And yet, how does this power migrate to the President? It goes back to as far as Harry Truman and running the war against North Korea without any authorization from Congress. He said, well, I got authorization from the UN Security Council. Well, if you go read the Constitution, it says nowhere that the Security Council of the United Nations gets to authorize war. Congress is not a synonym for UN Security Council, even the most latitudinary in use of the language. So, and since Harry Truman, that has become routine, where now it's just stunning. Americans don't challenge that, which say that is the most dangerous power to lodge in the executive because it means the end of our liberty. You're fighting war all of the time. And we can see what's happened with that power, with the attack on 9/11 and the enactment of the congressional, it's called authorization to use military force, which was used by President Bush initially to invade Afghanistan in hopes of capturing or killing those who were complicit in the 9/11 abominations. But think about the uniqueness of that authorization, which was never undergone any serious debate. For the first time in the history of the world, war was authorized against a tactic, not against a nation, a tactic. So you can't have like a surrender of Lee to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse or surrender at Tokyo Bay with the Japanese, because a tactic doesn't have any corporeal existence, right? So, and of course terrorism as a tactic has been with the species for thousands of years. It's always going to be a possibility. It's like declaring war against murder, right? Does it have an end point? No. So, the first thing that this authorization to use military force did, it put us in a state of perpetual warfare. The second thing that it did was, because a tactic has no geographic boundaries, it transformed what customarily was a battlefield that you could identify some parameters with. The battlefield is now everywhere. And you could argue that you can resort to military force and military law everywhere on the planet. Because we're on the battlefield, right? Terrorism could happen here, right? So we're on a battlefield. Indeed, the initial legal justification that was proffered by John Yoo in the executive branch, that was embraced by President Bush and the NSA at the outset, for initially capturing all of our phone conversations after 9/11 that had any international connection without any warrant at all. It was just done vacuum cleaner style. Was that since everybody was then on a battlefield, they were just collecting battlefield intelligence. Really? So when you called your neighbor, that's battlefield intelligence? But those things, so those were unique features of this authorization to use military force, putting us at war forever, and all of the planet being a battlefield. Now, the reason why this idea of warfare featured so importantly in the constitutional discussions of the Founding Fathers, and should feature importantly in our discussions today, is because the defining feature of war is that it makes what is ordinarily first-degree murder, it makes that legal, right? It makes what's ordinarily first-degree murder legal. Now that's a pretty frightening concept, right? This doesn't mean you never have to cross that Rubicon, but you ought to be pretty strict in deciding whether you're going there. And we all know, too, when you're at war, we're reluctant to condemn somebody from shooting too fast. Their life's on the line. It's unfair to hold them to the calmness of somebody sitting and, like Plato, deliberating about metaphysics. And so, more important, all the more important, say, before we go there, let's make clear that we are confronting a danger that threatens our national sovereignty. Threatens our national sovereignty. Now, some argue, I think fallaciously, well, we can't do nothing. You know, it can't be, if we don't do war, then, well, what can we do? Well, there are lots of things short of war. There are boycotts, right? There can be criminal charges. For example, one of those complicit in 9/11 abominations, Zacharias Moussaoui, he was charged with 3,000 counts of homicide. He was tried in the Eastern District of Virginia. He's now in life in prison. So, yeah, you can use the criminal law against these people. And the criminal law, contrary to popular myth, is not backward-looking only. Meaning, well, you wait and you find the bodies on the sidewalks and then you prosecute. There's something called the law of conspiracy. Two people get together and just talk about the idea of committing a terrorist act. That's already a criminal. In fact, all of the hundreds of post-9/11 terrorism prosecutions have been conspiracy cases. So that, and maybe you've read in the newspapers, oh, this conspiracy to commit a terrorist, nobody was ever in danger because we knew about it all along, right? We had informants that were providing some ideas to those who we suspected might decide to turn to terrorism. These are all forward-looking uses of the criminal justice system, short of war, to confront, which is going to be genuine dangers from abroad. And it is critical to our own preservation of liberty that warfare is confined to those issues that generally threaten the sovereignty of the United States. And in my view, 9/11 was not that threshold. It was terrible. It was an abomination. We prosecuted people for the murders. We should still do that. Mr. Moussaoui could have got the death sentence. The jury decided not to do that. I'm not opposed to death sentence in all circumstances, but that's after a trial. Now, and say that's so that the war power that has now migrated to the presidency is another example of our approach to one-branch tyranny, but then looks to the surveillance issue. I mean, the president began after 9/11, just wanted to spy on us, unilaterally. It was all in secret, didn't tell Congress anything. There were no judiciary involvement in providing warrants. And the whole thing would have probably still been secret except to leak to the New York Times that was published in December of 2005. And even though it is very clear that under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and this was a statute enacted after, if you remember the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s exposing NSA wrongdoing amongst other wrongdoing in surveilling American citizens, which, beside the way, included surveilling the chairman of the Church Committee, Senator Frank Church, who was a suspect. That only surveillance of Americans could be done with a judicial warrant, even though it was flouted. There are no prosecutions, nothing. Thousands of violations, say, because this continued for year after year after year without any warrants whatsoever. So the president can spy on us unilaterally, he can go to war unilaterally, he can kill us unilaterally, and now we have situations where the president decides unilaterally whether to suspend the operation of laws. Maybe it's the least dangerous, but could the president stand up and say, Obamacare is not working right, so you can go ahead and keep your insurance company. Or I don't like the immigration laws, so even if you're here illegally, I don't need to get Congress to change the law. I just decide I won't exercise the law. It'll be too controversial to pursue waterboarding as torture, so I won't issue pardons, I just will shut my eyes to it. So that, and most recently, whether you agree or not with marijuana, he said, well, all these money laundering laws would prevent banks from giving accounts to those who are involved in selling marijuana. Even if it was legal at the state level, it still wouldn't be at the federal level. So I'm just going to say we won't prosecute anybody who engages banks if we think that you're in compliance with state laws. And how can that was an impeachable offense when I was here under President Nixon, and he decided he wasn't going to faithfully execute the laws like should have happened after the Watergate burglary. We were supposed to find the culprits and punish them rather than try to obstruct justice. Those, I say, are just examples of the migration of all serious power to the executive branch. And the power is more dangerous than otherwise because there's no longer any real oversight. It's all secret unless you get leaks. And we have to rely upon a 29-year-old Edward Snowden to expose the NSA spying on us, not on Angela Merkel, on us, without any cause to believe we're engaged in any kind of wrongdoing whatsoever. A 29-year-old has to do that? Where is Congress demanding this information? They knew some of it, but they were too frightened to actually disclose it because the NSA and the president said, oh, this needs to remain secret. And if you actually disclose it like you should, we won't give you the information anymore. I mean, who they are to decide whether they give us the information. It's our information. They work for us. We don't work for them. But there isn't this outrage, this acceptance. Really? The people who sit on the House and Senate Intelligence Committees will tell you they learn more about what the NSA is doing from reading WikiLeaks than they get in the secret briefings. It is that bad. WikiLeaks is the overseer now, that scoundrel Julian Assange we have to rely upon, rather than the members of Congress. And the situation becomes further deplorable because the Founding Fathers created what was called the Speech or Debate Clause, Article 1, Section 6, Clause 2. Speech or Debate Clause says that members of Congress may not be held accountable, they can't be investigated by the executive branch for anything they do in the course of their legislative duties. And it was under the Speech or Debate Clause that then Senator Mike Gravel, in 1971, with the Pentagon Papers, which disclosed all the lies of the Johnson administration about the Vietnam War, he went and read 47 classified volumes of the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record. When he was investigated for espionage by the Nixon administration, he said, you can't do that, I have Speech or Debate Clause protection, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, correct, you do. So nothing happened to Senator Gravel. So you have that precedent. You have authority as a member of Congress to disclose anything you want. In the course of your oversight duties, the executive branch can't touch you. But what happens when the members of Congress knew about the secret spying on Americans under Section 215? They said nothing. They sort of hinted, well, you would be stunned if you actually knew what was going on, but why didn't anyone say anything? It took a 29-year-old contractor to say something's wrong here in the state of Denmark. I mean, that shows you, I think, I call it the invertebrate nature of the congressional branch. But it's also, however, makes the aggrandizement of the executive far more worrisome, because publicity, or as Justice Brandeis said, sunshine is the best disinfectant. But if you take the sunshine off of the executive branch and there's no congressional oversight, you're going to be certain to invite abuses. Then there's no check. Even if you believe that there should be some checks at the outset, this makes it far worse. The lack of transparency in our government, which, as I said, becomes worse and worse every day. And think of the mentality that this creates when we have someone like the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, go to Congress in March of 2013, say, before the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he's asked by Senator White, are you collecting data on millions of Americans? At least to include us to what we might ask, because we get to decide what Congress enacts as law. And he says, no, a flagrant lie, perjury. What happens? Does he get impeached? Does he get rebuked? Nothing. He goes on TV and says, well, it was the least untruth I could say, consistent with the national security. Could you imagine yourself in a court of law explaining to the judge, you know, Your Honor, it may not have been fully accurate, but it was the least untruth, so really just forgive me. Don't pay any attention to that. Not only is he not rebuked, the President himself gives Mr. Clapper responsibility for surveilling the intelligence community's activities to see what reforms would be appropriate. Really? This is the guy who lies to Congress? And we're going to give him the task of reforming the intelligence community? I mean, that shows how far we've come from the idea. Honesty is the calling of the realm, and we must have vigorous oversight. If it can't withstand public scrutiny, then it probably ought not to be done. And even if that were not true, there's one principle that was enshrined in the United States Declaration of Independence that maybe is as important as any other. Government by the consent of the government is legitimate. And in order for there to be consent, you have to know what your government is doing, right? How can you consent for something that's secret from you? And we see the danger that comes from violating that principle, because the only reason why the NSA's activities are now being contained is because we were informed of them and said no. And then there's retreat, and then there's declassification. All things have happened. Why? Because we knew about it and said we didn't want this. Well, President Obama said, oh, well, we had an internal investigation underway. We didn't need Edward Snowden. Really? Now, what was the gestation period of that internal investigation? 20 years, 50 years, 100 years? It wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen. So that disclosure shows why we can't really have government by the consent of the government honored unless we end secrecy. That doesn't mean the complete secrecy about where our troops located and when we have plans to go send a ship in a particular way. But I'm talking about secrecy about the policy. What was the huge harm that happened when we now understood the President is getting every single telephone call that we make and gathering metadata about it? What's the great, immediate, imminent danger that it creates to disclose that so we can decide whether we want that to happen? Nothing. It's the kind of disclosure that happens all the time in a democracy. That's how you make laws. That's how you establish policy, have a debate about it. I mean, really, the argument that, well, if you disclose it, then there might be evasive action by our enemies because they know we're trying to spy on them. Imagine that, that these enemies who grow up in countries in which they have known nothing but government spying on them from day one would be clueless as to whether we're trying to spy on them, right? I mean, how ridiculous is that? In any event, in our form of government, we let the enemy know what rules and laws we have because that's essential to who we are as a people. You might as well suggest that our laws against any kind of surveillance ought to all be secret and we shouldn't know about them. Because the fact that any of our laws are enacted by Congress means anybody can go on the internet and look up the statute and say, oh, you're authorizing the NSA to do X, Y, Z. Should all those be secret too? And you would take this fetish for secrecy too far. It would mean we should do the end of any public trials of any kind of terrorism-connected activity. Because if you have a public trial, then you'll alert the enemy who we captured. And then you'll suggest that, well, if we captured these people, then they'll be able to say, who knew Mr. Al-Madar? And then try to see where their vulnerabilities are. So we should never have any public trials. In fact, if we convict them, that should never be public either. Because then they feel if they're convicted, they might share information, and that would again would clue the enemy to possible evasive action or finding out weak points in their system. So let's just have everything in secret and never tell. People will disappear and no one will ever know what happened to them. That's the logical extension of this idea, is that, well, you can't let them know anything we're doing because they'll kind of adjust their tactics to it. And we destroy ourselves as a people. It's very ironic that of all those who were serving at the time of 9/11, that was Donald Rumsfeld, after the day after, who said, we lose if we change our tactics to emulate the enemy. Unfortunately, that's exactly what he did. So he didn't remember his own words. But that's what we have to avoid. Our standards are our standards, not theirs. Otherwise, we've lost our raison d'etre as a republic. Anyway, these, I don't know if I've gone over my time or probably well over my time. So I need guidance from your questions, which points you'd like to elaborate. I come back to the fundamental precept here. It's up to us to make changes. They aren't going to act on their own without outside public clout. Yes, sir? Us, with no belief at all that it relates to foreign intelligence alone. And we hope to get a decree out of a court that will require the disgorgement or the expungement, the destruction of the most staggering database that's ever been collected in the history of mankind. Every single phone call metadata, which includes the participating numbers of the caller and the receiver, and the time of the call, and the duration of the call, and probably the location. So we don't know whether they're being truthful in saying they don't collect that. And it's only a tiny, tiny step from those phone numbers to know that you can be identified with a phone number. So just go to Google, look at your phone number, and you'll find yourself very quickly. Or they could take the number and go to the phone companies and say, who's the subscriber that satisfies that number? And so that's what our lawsuit is about. So on behalf of every single member of the United States who's made these telephone calls, it requires some adjustment of the existing Supreme Court law. We expect it will get to the United States Supreme Court. And part of our goal as well, in terms of trying to demonstrate to the court that the American people do not believe that the government should be gathering and viewing all this metadata, is looking and getting resolutions of city councils, of state legislatures saying, we passed a resolution saying it is not right under the Fourth Amendment for the federal government to be doing that. And that active involvement helps our lawsuit, because that's part of the standards that the Fourth Amendment, as in the eyes of the Supreme Court, insists on. Does society recognize this intrusion on your privacy is reasonable or not? And we need to say, no, society does not. And you want to see that? These are all the resolutions saying, we don't want you to spy on us. We get to decide how safe we want to be, not you. Because it's our safety in our country, not yours. Anyway, that's the status of that lawsuit. Yes, sir.
Have there not been previous legal challenges to the FISA warrants?
These are not FISA warrants. These are warrants issued under, they're not actually warrants. They're orders, because warrant implies you have probable cause standard. These are orders that are issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that hears only the FBI side of the case. And they're companion cases. None of them are class actions, however. We think it's important to have 300 million plaintiffs to demonstrate what a fishing expedition this is, just in terms of the optics. Now there's one that's pending in the U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia that may go up on appeal. There's an ACLU case that just related to ACLU that's going up on appeal as well, and there's one filed out in California. So there are some companion cases. We think ours is more powerful because we have 300 million Americans in the class. And I think we want to utilize the resolutions. There are many state legislatures, we need to get Virginia there, who have said in our state prosecutions, we are prohibiting the use of evidence derived from the NSA's warrantless surveillance. They may try that at the federal level, we don't want it, because it's invasion of the privacy of our citizens. And again, that kind of activity is helpful in the litigation. These are demonstrations, concrete. The American people do not accept this. Aside from the fact that we know from at least general public opinion polls that the NSA is backtracking because all of it suggests Americans don't want this kind of intrusion on their privacy, even in the name of preventing some kind of terrorist attack.
What court have you filed?
U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. We think that makes most sense. That's where the defendants are located. That's where the activity occurs. And it's also a court that is reasonably abreast of its docket, so we don't expect, like some courts, to have a prolonged gestation period before we get a ruling. And then probably that will end up in the U.S. Supreme Court.
Thank you.
Yes?
What's your best guess as to what will happen with that
A lot of imponderables there. Yeah, I mean, maybe the short answer is whatever Vladimir Putin wants to do with him. You know, there's not a whole lot of due process in Russia. He's there only because Putin has permitted him to be there, because Putin thinks it's useful, it's bargaining leverage. Putin told Ed Snowden, when Snowden explained that he was a whistleblower and a freedom fighter, Putin responded, son, there are no NGOs in Russia. We're a nation state here. So you're here because you're leveraged against the United States, not because I believe in anything you're doing. And if you did that as a member of the Russian armed forces, you'd be in Siberia. Right? So, part of the difficulty of him trying to leave Russia, again indicated by our interception of the aircraft that was carrying the president of Bolivia back home, how is he going to get out of Russia and not invite some kind of kidnapping or interception? We have all the power in the world to do that. And the other problem that he confronts is, in my judgment, other than in China or in Russia, we have so much leverage over every other country in the world that why would he trust them not to swap it? Or if we don't have leverage, we would probably try to do a Chile overthrow or a Mossadegh overthrow if he went to some country like Bolivia or Ecuador, apparently he was searching for. So we'll just go in and change the government. I mean, we do that every place else around the world. I do not anticipate that Snowden himself would voluntarily return to the United States and confront the charges against him. I think the statements that have been made, they say betray and ignorance of the Constitution. Oh, he's guilty of treason. Well, he's had a trial? No. Has he accused of treason? No. But so what? He's guilty. Really? This is the United States. We're pronouncing people guilty without even a trial? You know, those statements coming from heads of the intelligence committees, John Kerry, even the president, well, that doesn't give you a high level of confidence to have a due process, even-handed prosecution. So I don't see him coming back. I think that his 1 year grace period in Russia is approaching. My guess, at least for the indefinite future, he will be in Russia. And I think that in some sense, no other country, even if they're inclined to be sympathetic, like Germany, wants them on their hands because they know the United States is going to be pounding their head over. We'll cut off aid here, and this is terrible, and we'll never share surveillance with you again because we're number one. So it makes it so risky to think about anything else.
Have there ever been any repercussions against Bruce Allen, who was his employer as a result of this?
Repercussions from the U.S. government?
From the US government, yes.
No, in part because they renounced him, and I think their chief executive said, no, Ed Snowden, none of us is Ed Snowden. He thought that was a compliment to Bruce Allen, that they would participate in this and conceal it all along. He said, yeah, you're right, you know? And that's the problem, right? That's the problem. And Bruce Allen revenues, it's, I think, $5 or $6 billion a year. It's like 98% from the federal government. And moreover, the Bruce Allen is an additional problem, I think, that relates to spying. Number one is that why are we subcontracting out to a private company whose sole purpose is to make money? The decision to spy on America? Are your loyalties to try to inflate the danger so you get a new contract, or to produce something that's accurate? The second problem that exposes our politics is that Booz Allen is run by people who used to be CIA, NSA heads, right? So it's sort of a revolving door. You know, Clapper was out there, and Mike McConnell, and now who was Hayden? Used to be head of CIA. Now they're making millions of dollars out there. So of course they have an intellectual conspiracy. Oh, this is the most important thing that's ever undertaken in the United States to stop terrorism. My gosh, every revelation of Snowden, the country is ready to fall down. And exaggerating the harm because they feel that their revenues are in jeopardy. Which we would expect of a private company. They say how many times our sole loyalty is to our shareholder. Correct. Not to the United States, which is why you should not be involved in this, because your loyalty isn't the United States. They don't see that. Yes.
This privatization of national security, of our military, is there data tracking the growth of that privatization and the decline of our liberty over the past 50 years?
Well, I don't, there's certainly information pattern showing how much money now is private contracting as opposed to like a government. I mean, if we take a gross figure, the NSA, however, has 35,000 employees, contractors maybe 15,000. But the contracting out, I think, is more of an earmark of our ever diminishing liberties, because it shows that those who are in government then start to think before they leave, where's my next job? Right? They don't want it. If they destroyed the private sector, where the heck would they go to get their 500,000 or $1 million a year contracts spying on us? So you end up with this vicious intellectual inbreeding, where all the experts who are called to be on the shows, the pundits, they all have an invested financial interest in exaggerating the danger and saying this is imperative. And the media doesn't say, Mr. Hayden, don't you make money off of frightening American people to try to suggest there's something for this credibility that's at issue? They're just silent, like, oh, he was former CIA director. Yeah, and he's making money off of it. So don't you think maybe he's CIA director, and even now he's exaggerating the danger? And say that's just another example of why I think we continue to have this deterioration, because the public debate is not about liberty. For every single word you hear, the time you hear liberty used, 1,000 times safety. Liberty is in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Where is safety? Now, you don't want to ignore safety. It's an important thing. We don't want to be crazy. But we have to choose between the default position, liberty, as opposed to absolute safety. Yeah, we've got to take some risks. And they're going to be tragedies. They're going to be tragedies in life. But what's more tragic than expunging all of our rights to choose and live in the idea that, well, we just should live in an absolutely free existence even if we're reduced to vassals and serfs. I don't want to live as a vassal and serf even if I'm absolutely safe, because then the reason for living sort of evaporates.
Are lawsuits a good approach to challenging the other violations of the Constitution?
Yes, lawsuits are, but I think we need to recognize that much of constitutional law follows the general orthodoxies or values of the society. I mean, one glaring example was during all those decades that elapsed where we had separate but equal, we had really the deprivation of blacks in any enjoyment of the civil rights. When we had a culture of white supremacy, it didn't matter what the Civil War amendments said. The culture of white supremacy just destroyed it. So we have to think not only of the lawsuits, and there have been efforts to try to get the judiciary to declare wars illegal. They've been unsuccessful. There have been efforts to try to get judicial rulings on the drone program. But they've said, well, you don't have standing. The fact is the only plaintiff who's proper is now dead. You're just the father, and so a corpse can't bring a lawsuit. Technical barriers that the courts have wielded to try to prevent some of these issues there. So courts are useful, and they're independent, but it has to be in conjunction with this larger effort to change societal thinking about whether this is something we want to accept or not. And that includes, congressional legislation, resolutions at the state legislature, resolutions of the city council, including the Charlottesville City Council. And these are things that have been historically important. The very first examples were after the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were passed that were tyrannical and abridged free speech. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson they drafted what's called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which had those state legislatures saying, we think you've usurped power that isn't there, you're violating the Constitution, and we're making an official remonstrance. And the Sedition Act lapsed. It wasn't kindled again. That's 200 years ago. Where's that happening today? Because we don't need archaeology to know of the abuses. You just read them on the newspapers. What's stunning is, with the knowledge, complacency. So that goes hand in hand with litigation is important as well. Because after all, the whole idea of a constitution is to limit what the majority wants. Even if the majority wants it by 99 to 1. The Constitution is there to say there's certain kinds of issues that we don't think simple majorities can handle even-handedly and in measured steps appropriately, and we're going to place them off limits. And the judiciary is there to enforce those limits. This idea that if the judiciary strikes down activity, it's activism, that's what they're there for. If they weren't to strike down anything, why would we need a constitution? Just whatever the majority wants, they get. That'd be like the British system, but we don't have that system. That's why litigation is important. I think sometimes in states of high fear and emergency, the judiciary improperly becomes intimidated. Well, it's not up to us. We defer to the executive branch in times of danger. I mean, that really has logic on its head. It's in times of danger, where judgments become imbalanced, where people are easily frightened, where the importance of judiciary is at its zenith, because that's when overreaction is likely to be greatest. That's where policing the majorities is most important. It's most important. It's as James Clapper said, if we did this right after 9/11, no one would care. Which is exactly why the judiciary should. Because everyone would have been frightened if they disclosed this right after 9/11. No, we can't take any chances. And that's something I try to teach the judges. It's true. The judges don't have the expertise of the executive branch or even the legislature. True. But the importance of judging is that they are impartial. They have no political agenda out there to vindicate. The executive and legislature do, which is why we need to encourage the judges. You have to make your independent decision, even if it's based on somewhat absence of information and sophistication. We know it won't purposely stumble. Whereas the problem of the executive branch is not that they don't have the information, but their incentive to lie about it is huge, right? So we don't trust them with a decision, not because they don't know, but because they will warp what the reality is in order to advance a political agenda. But certainly, litigation is an important component of this fight. But we can't single out any one element. It's got to be all working in tandem. Legislative, civic resolutions, judicial challenges, all of that comes together in order to rein in the Leviathan state. Yes, sir.
Why wasn't there outrage when the phrase war on terror was first uttered? Because that's really the beginning of this never-ending war concept that we all seem to accept now.
Yeah. Well, I think that I don't want to exaggerate too much bad faith, but I think that both the executive officials and members of Congress attempted to frighten us in thinking that the war on terror was like fighting Hitler and Stalin and Hirohito and every devil in the history of the world at the same time. I said, really? I did a calculation once to see if we use the troop to enemy ratio that was in Afghanistan, we having the troops, the enemy being Al-Qaeda. We used that ratio in World War II to the German troops and the Japanese who we were fighting. We would have had to, in World War II, fielded a military of, I think, 3.5 billion Americans. We'd have to multiply the population, I think, by 126 and conscript everyone. I mean, it was a staggering number. That shows you how much we have exaggerated a genuine fear and threat, no doubt about it. But to make it seem like we're under siege. And so, my gosh, we have James Clapper. He's gone regularly to the Congress of the United States, and he said, I've never lived in more perilous times. This is the most dangerous time in my entire life. This is absurd. Did you live through the Cuban Missile Crisis like I did, and probably many of you in the audience? I remember riding my bicycle and thinking this is the last days, right? And now we have James Clapper. You're more likely to be killed by a vending machine crashing on you than by a terrorist attack. So that this fear of terrorism was so inflated, took something that was genuine but can be addressed seriously and focused, and made it seem like the whole world is crumbling. And so, my gosh, we have to resort to everything. And that's why you find not only the references to Hirohito and Stalin and Hitler, but then you hear claims, oh, if you back down, this is a Munich surrender, and it's like all these World War II analogies. You remember World War II? We had an enemy, V-1, V-2 rockets, huge industrial bases, armed, they had air forces. What is Al-Qaeda? No, maybe they're 50 in Afghanistan. They have not a single air force. They have not a single ship. They have no power to conscript. They have no industrial base. They have no scientists to invent anything. And suddenly they're like World War II danger? I mean, the whole idea is so preposterous. And to say that is not to denigrate that they are. That these people who are in Al-Qaeda, they have us out to be attacked in some way. Like people who walk into schools and shoot guns. But it can be handled with a vigorous application of criminal justice. Indeed, what did we do for the first hijacker we caught? We subject him to a civilian trial, convicted him of 3,000 counts of murder, and he's sitting in prison. Well, then what's changed? Why is that model not one that's sufficient? Now, the argument on the other side goes something like this. Well, we tried prosecutions with USS Cole prior to 9/11. Got convictions. But 9/11 still happened. Ergo, prosecutions don't work. I said, really? Well, how about saying that we tried prosecuting people for murder, 17,000 murders about annually. We sentenced some to death, but we still have murders. So I guess the murder laws don't work. Indeed, if a flawless compliance with the law is the standard of an effective statute, none of them work. Can anyone even think of any law that's obeyed 100% of the time? Doesn't exist. So this idea that, well, we tried prosecution and there was still continuing terrorism, it doesn't work, is a ridiculous argument. That argument could be launched against every single prohibition. Rape, burglary, theft, fraud, anything. We might as well throw out all the laws then. Huh? And that passes for an argument? But we go back to the fundamental point. It is this, whether intentional or not, the inflation of fear that's easily induced in all countries because we're inclined instinctively, before we use our head, to choose safety over liberty. We need to use our brains to stop and say, wait a minute, we need to think of the ramifications. And it really has been very, very, I think, damning of our leaders that none of them stood up and said, no, we've got to take some risk. Let's look at the real danger of Al-Qaeda, and let's focus on that. Is it really war? Is it really Wernher von Braun building V-1, V-2 rockets? Or can we handle this with a vigorous application of criminal justice, knowing that there may be other terrorist acts? That's all what I can say about it.
We have one more question, or two more questions.
I'll stay
Okay.
longer if you want. These are
Oh, that's fine. No, you're okay.
They came out here. This is my life. This is citizens. I have an obligation to stay if you have questions.
No,
That's
you're
my
fine.
moral responsibility as a citizen.
Now, just in a brief moment of fantasy, how can you bring a class action suit against the president? How can we stop him? Congress isn't doing it.
No, but maybe a judge can. That's happened in Nixon.
But he's packing the courts.
Well, he is. Nixon packed courts too. In the tapes case, the court said you hand over the tapes and his presidency was gone. So, I mean, President Obama is a named defendant. It's not ordinary litigation where you sue the President of the United States, but he's the one who's responsible and orders this. And I do believe, still in the United States today, that if the United States Supreme Court said stop, he would comply. Just remember, this is somebody, when all those telegrams came in from the American people, maybe not telegrams, emails, said you cannot go to war to Syria, he flinched. He backed down. Because I know that he had ready to throw probably 800 Tomahawk missiles that had been geared up to go hit into Syria before that public opposition surfaced loud and clear. So I still think we have enough remnants of our rule of law ethos that the president would comply with an order of the court.
Quick question, societally, how close do you think we are to the tipping point?
To what tipping
To a
point? Well, I think that we have maybe 20 or 30 years before, if we don't change the trajectory, because the envelope gets pushed every presidency. It may be the difference between Adagio and Allegro about how fast we're going off the cliff, but there's only one direction this goes in, right? And if the presidency already has a staggering amount of power, somebody has to stand up and said, enough is enough. And in some sense, I've encouraged them and drafted articles of impeachment that is the final check on executive abuses. You are no longer a safe custodian of our liberties. You leave. We don't send you to the guillotine. You just can't be the office holder exercising that power. I mean, it's amazing to me who was baptized with the Nixon impeachment. I think I've been involved in more impeachments than anybody else in the United States. And I go back that far. That today, well, impeachment of banana republics only do impeachment. It is the most, Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention, when the impeachment power was discussed, remember, it's lodged in the House to charge high crimes or misdemeanors with a majority, then it gets triable in the Senate, said, we need impeachment because it is a substitute for assassination to get rid of tyrants. It is the civilized way, where you have due process, you have considered judgment, and what happens? There's the punishment. It isn't you lose your estate, you go to prison, you just lose office. But Nixon, when he was driven from office, he became an elder statesman. No one was suggesting that he was somehow hounded and persecuted, like Khrushchev, to go to Siberia after he was pushed out by Brezhnev. So what is this fright about impeachment? It just sounds like a coup d'etat. It's the opposite of a coup d'etat. And we need to recognize that that ultimately is the check. Now, I served in the Reagan administration, and the Nixon impeachment was still very, very vibrant, and it worked as a deterrent. In the Reagan administration, we talked about Iran-Contra. Oh, you can't do that. We can't sell arms to hostages and flout what was then provisions regulating what the CIA could do, the role in the moment. And James Baker was saying, Mr. President, that's an impeachable offense. You can't do that. And that was still remembered distinctly because of the Nixon experience. Now, what is the president going to think? We can do anything we want. Congress does nothing. I mean, zero. Even when the usurpation is flouted in the congressional face like it was over Libya. When there was some inquiry on the House side, why can you go to war in Libya? He said, because I feel like it. He wouldn't even, President Obama wouldn't even respond to questions that were sent to him by House Speaker Boehner. I don't want to respond. Okay, if you really feel that seriously about it, we don't want to do our jobs.
It's been speculated that suppose he just doesn't leave at the end of his term.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do?
Yeah.
I mean, he's not following anything else.
Right. No, you're exactly right.
What
That's,
do we do?
that's why the question raised, well, so he flouts the judicial order. Big deal. He flouts everything else under the sun. So, listen, this is it broaches a question that fortunately, the United States has not really had to confront like some other countries. But it's addressed in the Declaration of Independence. When he says, and it's more of a, I suppose, a political than a legal question, that when the Founding Fathers were explaining why they decided to declare independence and take up arms, because they didn't win independence with sit-down strikes or embargoes. They had to take up arms. Lexington and Concord, people had real rifles, right? It says that experience teaches that we should be tolerant of abuses. Because, at least some, we shouldn't be too eager to go to revolution. Because changes of forms of government oftentimes invite tyrants to power. Ordinarily, when you look at situations of great strife and convulsion, wretches rise to the tops because they're totally ruthless and don't care. But, he says, that's not always the case. That you have, he says, not only a right, you have a duty to overthrow any system of government that evinces a design and plan to reduce you to victims of tyranny. And they explain, and that is exactly what happened with King George III. All his acts, the taxation without representation, the taking Americans abroad for trial, the encouragement of Indian attacks. When you reach that level, you have a right, you have a duty to overthrow the government and seek to develop new forms that will be more preservative of your unalienable rights. They remembered, however, that that is not a threshold that is easily satisfied, and were cautious. And basically what you've described, at a point where a president says, the heck with with term limits on the presidency, the heck with what the courts do, I will just do what they want. At that point, we're not talking constitutional law. We're talking about going back to ground one, establishing the rights of the people and sovereignty. And you know what? We get to decide, because ultimate sovereignty in our concept of human beings is the people. That's where sovereignty begins. The government only gets powers that we surrender to it. It's not like previous dispensations where it's thought some authority, the Pope or emperors, had all the power, and we tried to grab a few rights from this omnipotent authority. That's not the way we are as a people. We are sovereign. Me, you, everyone here. And we have collectively surrendered it to government temporarily. And that's where it returns to if the government says, no longer are we going to comply with the mandate and the stewardship with which you entrusted your liberty to us. And we have to say, well, that's not going to work. Now, if the president did that, then what's he going to do? This is where, again, it comes into moral ethos. There's an obligation of every officer of the United States, and certainly members of the military, to disobey a clearly illegal order. So if the system is operating properly, that president should have nobody who obeys him, because everything he does at that point is illegal. And especially in military law, the military says you have an obligation, not an option, an obligation to disobey a clearly illegal order. So if we remain healthy to our precepts, the president could do that, and he'd be completely abandoned and would be able to do nothing because no one would cooperate with him. It is a little bit disturbing to me, having grown up in Watergate and seeing people quit and resign, Elliot Richardson, Bill Harkness, to look at current administrations and nobody quits. Nobody says, I can't do this, Mr. President. Who are the people in NSA? Ed Snowden was not NSA who said, Mr. President, you can't just go spy on America without any warrants at all. What's their wrongdoing? Nothing. Complete silence. 35,000 employees. Say, that's earmark of, say, the decaying ethos and devotion we have to liberty in our country. And it's up to us to save it. It's not going to happen by spontaneous combustion with the powers that be. We have now not only a military-industrial complex, we have military-industrial terrorism complex. So there's a huge amount of money at stake here. A huge amount of status and prestige. They're not going to surrender unless we tell them you have to, because you otherwise lose our confidence and the ability to govern. Yes, sir.
Miss, I was just thinking that in the political system that we have, what's important or vital interest, liberty is almost irrelevant. Unions want to make more money. Military-industrial complex wants to gain power. The press wants to do what the press wants to do. There's the oligarchy. There's a significant oligarchy in America that has interest. So, when you start taking these people on the issue of liberty, it's almost irrelevant. It's intellectually relevant, but when you get down to what's really going to gain money in my pocket, what's going to make my children safe, are we going to make sure that the criminals go to jail? That's what's important. So to promote the concept of liberty, is going to have to take some other force.
Well,
the people can't do it. It's
Well,
beyond the people.
Well, I mean, the answer I think is yes and no. I think it's a very prescient observation. But ultimately, this inculcation of a devotion to liberty needs to be in the classroom, it needs to be in the civic text, it needs to be in the breakfast table, in the dinner table. That is what has been used. And there is no form of government whatsoever that, no matter how much devoted to liberty in its external features, that can survive a people who no longer care about it and are unwilling to fight about it. Justice Holmes once said, you know, what are your rights, what you're willing to fight and die for. So if you don't care anymore, Edmund R. Murrow, people of sheep, government of wolves. You don't fight for it, the government will take it away from you. And that is, and I agree with you, the institutional powers, they don't care about it. They just want to aggrandize what they think is beneficial to them. And it's up to the culture to say, no, we don't want that. We are going to train and exercise our rights as citizens to demand that liberty is number one, if not, you lose power. It's a very, very daunting task. But it was very, very daunting to the American founders as well, to get the people, because at that time, not everybody said we wanted to go to the Boston Tea Party and liberty was important. There were many then, a huge number. We have to be devoted to King George III, and what does it mean? You know, we'll lose some of our money. But I think it was a distinctive and very, very admirable feature of that generation. Said, no, that does not matter. Liberty comes first. And repeatedly, people like Sam Adams said, listen, this country is not about making money. It's about being free. And that then inspired those. To say, when I quoted from those words of Pitt the Elder about the Fourth Amendment, I mean, think of the spirit of that. That was what motivated these people. That's the spirit of liberty. Even the King of England can't cross this darn threshold. Now, without a warrant. I mean, today, have you heard anyone say anything like that in Congress or the executive branch celebrating liberty? No, because it has to reside in the people. Now, I'd be the first one to say it's a daunting task, and it's difficult to know, given those powers, how do you get this information into the civic textbooks? How do you get the teachers to teach this? Because it's the institutional framework that already establishes, you know, what textbooks are there and how you craft X or treat Y and Z. It's some level of mystery as to how cultures change. We certainly know it's gone downhill. But all we can do is try our best in our own conversations, our own activism, writing, speaking. It may fail, but for me, the earmark of success is we tried. We didn't know anything else to do. It may well be, but despite our best efforts, we will fail. The very first person who spoke out against slavery probably died, and we don't even know who he was. But we're glad he did it, because at least it set a standard that could be picked up at a more propitious moment. And that, in some sense, in my view, is what we're really about. I'm not starry-eyed about any ability to change this, because I've read lots of books and seen empires do the same thing. But there's nothing else to do than to try and say, that's just wrong. I don't want to be complicit in this wrongdoing. I'm ashamed of what our government is doing. And that, in a sense, has to be its own reward. It can't be, well, I don't see being progress made, X, Y, Z, let's give up. We can't do it. It's too important to our posterity, and at least with regard to remembering that our founding fathers, all those who came before us, they didn't give up. That's why we're here tonight, why we can exercise some free speech, even if it's less robust in its possibilities of success than we'd like. And so in order to redeem their sacrifices, whether we succeed or not, we have to emulate that standard.
My problem is I can't envision a vehicle that could be evolved in our culture that could take this on. One individual speaking out. I mean, I've been involved in politics with a lot of political campaigns, and I understand what goes on in the process. In fact, I'm investigated by the FBI, the largest FBI raid in East Bay history in San Francisco. I understand all this stuff, but I've been there. I do not see a vehicle. There has to be some vehicle. There has to be some entity that can go forward with the message. I mean, you wrote a book, and that's a good thing. But is it going to create the vehicle?
I don't know whether.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. You have to institutionalize it rather than just have ad hoc, episodic gestures here. Unless you can form organizations, private organizations, 501c3, and see whether you can attract some money. My belief now, after having devoted time putting things on words, is that what is essential is to capture the words that we've shared this evening in drama. You got to put it in a play. I don't know what to call it. I thought of White House decision where people come in, Mr. President, we've got to attack X, Y, Z, and somebody says, no, Mr. President, we can't do that. What would it do to George Washington and James Madison? But you have to dramatize it because people don't read anything, or not more than a few words. So then they can focus, then they can see the emotions that are involved here and what really is at stake, because they don't absorb information in other ways. And that's what I've thought about going to Yale Drama School, because I do think that a drama like this would capture the American people. It's trying to get the spirit back, like William Pitt the Elder and James Otis, and making it clear why these are important and how heroic that is. And we're not talking about Wall Street and GNP. We're talking about liberty, the moral philosophy of who we are as a people. We don't do that, Mr. President. Even if we killed them, we're going to kill others, and that's not who we want to be. We don't want to kill 68-year-old grandmothers going after terrorists, even if it means we take a risk, because that's what it means to be an American. I mean, that's got to be in there so that this audience leaves says, wow, that really is what we country ought to be about. Now, other than, institutionalizing it, I've always thought about trying to establish what I call a leadership institute that teaches moral precepts to future leaders and say, this is what you need to do. You need to stand up there and say, you know what, I'm not reckless, but I cannot and will not make you absolutely safe, because I'm going to preserve your liberty, and that requires taking some risk. Instead of everybody, well, I'll make you safer and safer and safer, and just ratcheting this up ever and ever higher standards of surveillance and invasions of liberty. Somebody's got to stand up and say, no, I cannot and will not make you absolutely safe. And that's to fear you can live a life of freedom. I don't want to reduce you